Okay, perfect. So, hello everyone. Today I'm the temporary host of the EEG talk. I'm Yikang Che, a second-year PhD student from the Energy and Environment group from Cambridge. And today we have the great honor to have Professor Cyrill Stachniss, who is a full professor at the University of Bonn and head of the photogrammetry and robotics lab. His research mainly focuses on probabilistic techniques as well as learning approaches for mobile robotics, perception, and navigation. They also have quite a lot of application for agriculture and forest. And he has co-authored over 300 publications and has coordinated multiple large-scale research projects on the national and European level, along with quite a few startups. So Professor Stachniss, the floor is yours.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and happy to be here and entertain you for your lunch time with mobile robotics activities that we are doing here in Bonn and associated places in terms of using robotics technology to improve sustainability in crop production. So we are a large team of people from different disciplines, robotics, other engineering disciplines, computer science, but also agriculture and economics people, in order to kind of change crop production and the way we produce crops in our fields, and kind of exploiting robotics and sensing technology in order to do that in a more sustainable manner. So first of all, why should you care about all that? We as society rely on the production of biomass that we are doing in substantial amounts on our fields. And we do that in order to kind of produce food that we eat, to produce feed for the animals that we may eat later on, fiber, biofuel, different products that we are using and we are relying on as a society require biomass production. And there are several challenges in biomass production in that form in our fields. So for example, we see an increase in yield, so we need to produce more for different reasons. One of the reasons, for example, is the change in the way we fill gas in our cars, and the production of biofuel nearly doubled kind of from 2007 to 2017 as one example. This creates a substantial demand that wasn't there before, but also other factors play a role. What we eat plays a role. So for example, if we eat beef, the cow first needs to eat a lot of grass, for example, that is grown in terms of biomass. And we can basically roughly say that if we produce meat, we need 7 to 10 times more land to produce the same amount of calories that we would be eating otherwise. And by changing our diets, by eating more meat, we are basically increasing the demand that we're having. So there are different drivers who kind of push up the yield that we need to produce more. At the same point in time, agriculture has substantial negative impacts on our agroecosystems. There are several studies, for example, saying that in Germany, we lost 75% of the flying biomass, even in protected areas over the last 30 years. And one of those drivers has been agriculture. So there has been some corrections to those numbers, but in general, we see roughly a 8 to 9% decline in insect biomass per decade happening overall. So crop production has negative impacts, and in general, we can see this as three main challenges. We need to close the yield gap. We need to produce more. Numbers are something between 35 and 60% by 2050. We have a dramatic loss in biodiversity, often as a direct consequence of agricultural activity. And this is often related to high pesticide use. And we need to reduce pesticides in order to produce more sustainably. So a lot of the research activities that we are doing actually focus around the question, how can we reduce the negative impact of crop production on our ecosystems, and at the same point in time, do not, or address, or at least do not jeopardize the demand for an increased yield. And again, you can imagine that there are a large number of different research groups can center around this question. And from our side, we address this more from a technical perspective, but we have other people who also address this more from a societal perspective. So in Phenerop, which is a large, we call the Cluster of Excellence, it's a large-scale funding project. They're given out every 7 years in Germany with competitions across all disciplines. And we were very happy to win one of those grants. It's called Phenerop, Robotics and Phenotyping for Sustainable Crop Production. And this area, or the cluster, has basically three larger research areas. One is focusing on developing robotics, machine learning technologies, everything which is tech related, in order to come up with new approaches to make contributions towards more sustainable crop production. But we have also the people from the plant sciences, which try to use those technologies and to better understand plant growth, plant-soil interactions, the reaction of plants to stresses, and how we can optimize the procedures, also looking into breeding support using those technologies. And then we need to integrate this into the environment and into also the economy, because in the end, if we are just providing a new solution which works great in our test farms, we won't change anything in terms of sustainability in the long run. And so we need to find ways that farmers can adopt those technologies and make it attractive for them. For example, policies are needed in order to bring those systems into place. In my talk here, I will talk about the areas where I'm active on. It's this first research area looking into robotics and perception technologies to equip those technical systems with the capabilities to contribute towards sustainable crop production. And you may ask yourself, how can a roboticist actually help sustainable crop production? So what can we do in order to support the growth of plants, reducing negative impacts on our agroecosystems? And basically, there are two tasks we can support. The first thing is monitoring, which basically means understanding or knowing what's going on in the field. And then second is performing intervention actions, so actually doing the right thing based on what we know in order to, protect plants, optimize yield, or different activities. So I'll start with my talk from the monitoring side, and we'll tell you a little bit what we're doing in monitoring and what technical challenges are that we are focused here, and then look into possible intervention techniques, what we can do in order to do the right thing on the field. So let's start with monitoring. We want to understand what's going on the field. What is the status quo right now? The easiest way to do that is you buy a drone, and this image, it's a kind of fairly old DJI Phantom 4 drone, used to make cool YouTube videos, 5 to 8 years back, and you basically point your camera downwards and you fly over your field. This allows you to take images, and so you get high-resolution images from plants that are growing on the field, like sugar beet plants you can see here in this image. So we can fly with a drone of the field and acquire image data, and then we need to interpret this data. And the question is, how does it work? How can we understand what we are seeing? Not just seeing, oh, there's a green pixel, or there are green pixels, but actually understanding, oh, that is a certain type of plant. So basically what we need to do is a semantic scene interpretation for robots operating in the field. So if you're more from the computer vision side, tasks like semantic segmentation will immediately pop up here. Sometimes it's called scene understanding. So different words for similar activities, but we basically need to put the robots or the drones into the state that they have an understanding of what they are seeing. So how do we do that? How can we assign to every pixel in an image a label that tells me what do we actually see? And the easiest form for that is something that's called semantic segmentation, and that is typically done with some form of neural networks. There are a large number of networks out there that you can use in order to do that. So you have a camera image that you feed into the network. The network processes some features, reduces it to some kind of features, and then makes a decision or what it's actually seeing. Basically scaling this up again on the other side and then assigning to every pixel a color. So in this example, green would be a sugar beet plant, so the plant that we actually want to grow on the field. Red would be a wheat plant, and kind of the background is here in black blurred out. Now we can do this for every image, and we have some idea of where we are and how the images belong together with traditional photogrammetry techniques. We can actually analyze the current status on the field, can identify what's going on. So in this example, with a drone flying over a field, you basically see a top-down image, and we can zoom into this image and perform this semantic segmentation. We can see here in green, for example, all the sugar beet plants. So in some areas we see, well, everything looks pretty good. There's only green pixels, everything is fine, they're nicely oriented in the rows where we expect them to be. No action is needed there. In other areas, however, we can see that there are these pink spots on the top left, which are actually wheat plants. So there's a wheat pressure, and in this area, there are kind of a lot of weeds that we need to fight in order to kind of not compromise our yield. In other areas, we may see a small growth because kind of the number of green pixels per plant are simply smaller. And we may want to, for example, add fertilization actions in this area in order to kind of stimulate the plant growth. And this is something that we can do using standard techniques for doing image interpretation, like standard, whatever, CNN for semantic segmentation. The problem that we are typically having in those environments compared to other areas is that it's not as it's harder, or it's not as easy to find a lot of labeled images from the agricultural domain. So if you look how many images you find on the internet which are labeled with cats and dogs, you will find actually a large number, but a much smaller number of people has labeled images saying, oh, that's a sugar beet plant, that's a wheat, that's whatever you're growing on your field. So we suffer a lot from the challenges of kind of having a robust operations under varying conditions, and also even training systems in one place and transferring it to the other side. So for example, training a classification system on our side in Bonn and shipping it to our partners in Zurich, for example, will actually lead to reduced performance of those environments. So a lot of the activities look into generalization and being robust under different conditions. And so there are different things that you can do that you have to address. Questions like how to generalize well to new situations, how to be successful with small amounts of training data, that we can extract more information out of the training data, or that we can embed background knowledge into our classification systems to kind of better generalize to new situations and not learn everything from scratch. And also for the action execution, kind of, we need to exploit the information for doing the right thing. How can we do that? For example, performing crop protection and trying to eliminate the weed without using the same amount of herbicides that we need to do right now. So how can we do the right thing? And again, we'll start with this perception part and then look into the action part. And so we started with, what you typically do, you start with neural networks and you have your input image in here. I have a lot of audio feedback here. Okay, perfect, thank you. And so what a typical neural network does, if you train it with kind of those pairs of labeled images, is that the network basically jointly learns a feature, and based on this feature, then the segmentation decision that is made. So compared to kind of more old school machine learning techniques where humans provided features, those networks also learn those features, which is a powerful capability, but often requires more training data than if you would provide the features and would only learn which features are useful for making the decision, how the decision in the end is made. And so we also started with those techniques in the kind of pre-deep learning time. At that point in time, random forests were quite popular, and we used a lot of random forests to do those tasks. And there are certain features that you can extract from those images, which are actually not very fancy features. It could be edges, it could be gradients in your image, certain color indices, some of them from the agricultural domain, some from other domains. And those were features which performed really well on those random forests. And so one of the things we tried first in order to improve those generalization capabilities is kind of saying, okay, let's take those features that we used in the pre-deep learning times and add them to our image, and basically creating a higher dimensional image, not just RGB channels, but let's say whatever, 10, 15, 20 dimensional images, which have those feature masks attached to it, or masks, but actually feature layers attached to it. So this basically leads then to images that you can not just add a 3-dimensional image or a 3-channel image to your neural network, but you can add a higher, in this case, a 14-dimensional input image, which has those additional feature maps. And so the neural network can actually look into those feature maps and say, okay, that's actually a pretty neat feature to start with, and make a decision based on that. If you train the network so you basically bootstrap the network, providing them features which are useful for making a decision. And the nice thing, or the two nice things about these kind of approaches. So the first thing is you don't really need to change your neural network a lot. You can basically run your regular neural network architecture, just make sure you can process whatever 14-dimensional input images instead of 3-dimensional input images. But you don't need to put explicit background knowledge into the network in a more complex fashion. And the second thing is, the longer you train your network, the more it can use those features and adapt them and combine them in a smart way, or maybe even completely recompute the features, because those input maps in the end only represent data that was already in the original image. And this can lead to neural networks which are much more effective with small amounts of training data. So in this kind of 10 to tens or hundreds of your training data, you get similar performances. And you also increase the generalization capabilities of those networks. So if you take those networks and ship them into new environments, they typically perform better because they already use or rely on pretty useful features. So they make the decision based on features which have proven to be good. Again, if you train the long run with huge amount of training data, those effects will go to zero, but especially in those areas where you have little training data, that's quite useful. What you then can do is you can take those networks, and these have been first examples where we used it on larger scale, like this is a breeding plot. So this is a field where you see those small stripes, and every stripe is a different variety of crop which has been planted here. So you can take a drone, fly over this field, and actually build those maps where all the different stripes is a different crop variety which you want to analyze in terms of performance, how do they react to stresses, how fast do they grow, for example. And we can generate those maps by basically using these semantic information and the segmentation, but also instance information to kind of count individual crops and see how they perform, and then actually automatically provide those analysis. And this then allows breeding companies to quicker and more objectively make the decision which variety performs well. And you can even go a step further and do experiments like ear counting in wheat, which is useful for predicting crop and something that you as a human would never do, but it actually allows your the system that you have out there to make faster decision what's going on in the field and make better predictions about the future. And this is something that we also spin off in one of the companies, one of the startups here from the lab, a company called Phenerop, which provides drone-based services in terms of analyzing what's going on your field. And this was kind of the first step that made it successful to generalize those systems to a large variety of different environments and different crops that we're actually dealing with. More recently, we have also tried to find different ways for dealing with, let's say, smaller amounts of training data. So we are often confronted with the fact that labeling images, especially labeling every pixel in an image, is pretty time consuming. Actually, for the plant domain, you typically need domain experts to do that. So you cannot just hire a large number of students and ask them to label images. You actually have to have some domain knowledge in there, and that makes it hard. And if we try to say, okay, we typically don't want to label the whole image, can we also go with partial annotation so that we only need to annotate some parts of the image we are interested in, or where our system isn't performing really well, or which we may be able even to do in a semi-automatic manner later on, and ignore the rest of the image for that. And so we looked into approach on how can we deal with partial annotation. So in this image, you see some areas of the image which are annotated in terms of semantic information. So what's background, what's a value crop, what's a wheat, and other areas where you talk about instance information, because typically you want to have semantic information and instance information. And there are large areas of the image which are not annotated, and only a small fraction of the images which are annotated. And we want to deal with those partial annotations to do that. So again, why are we interested in that? On the one hand side, we can better react to failures and don't want to annotate large-scale images for the system. We can focus on areas where the system made a mistake. But we can also try to semi-automatically, let's say, annotate those images. So for example, we often see crop rows in our field. So because we bring out, or for a lot of crops, you bring out the seeds in rows because it makes them easier to manage the field later on. And so we know that there are certain crop rows, and we can identify those crop rows. And then, of course, in a crop row, plants that we see are more likely to be the value crop, and stuff outside the row is more likely to be yield. Even with kind of small priors like this, we can actually improve the system quite a bit, and then can also compute vegetation mass, which is fairly easy to do. And then overlay the crop rows with those vegetation masks, and then can annotate that certain pixels are crop pixels, other pixels are soil pixels. So we can actually move to those partially annotated images. And the question is, how can we feed those easy into our segmentation systems? Because we can actually generate them fairly easily compared to letting students do all the annotation work. So one branch of research that we have done in the lab over the last 1 to 2 years was kind of how can we better deal or effectively deal with those partial annotations. And in order to kind of get an idea on what the problem here is with those partial annotations, let's look into a typical what's called panoptic segmentation network, which combines semantic segmentation, so saying for every pixel, what is it what we are seeing? So this is whatever a wheat, a background pixel, sugar beet plant. This is kind of the semantic information. And we want to have also instance information. So this is planet number 1, this is planet number 2, which is information we need for certain analysis. It typically happens that you have one encoder in those networks and kind of 2 decoders. One decoder generates you the semantic information, so saying this is crop, this is wheat, which you see here on the top image. And the second one tries to find plant ID, so instance information, so to say, so whatever. This is crop number 1, crop number 2, crop number 3, and so on. And I want to now focus on this kind of instance part here. So we look into those instant part. What those networks are actually doing, or most of them are doing, they basically want to group those pixels and want to group those pixels which belong to the same plant. In order to do that, the second decoder often generates output vectors, which are basically vectors in the 2D image. So a delta x and delta y shift vector for every pixel, so that you basically shift those pixels to the center of the plant or the center of the object you want to represent with one instance. So this example over here, you see those blue arrows and those yellow arrows that stem from leaves corresponding to different crops, and so you want to shift them in a way that they are shifted to those red dots, and then you basically have an information which leaves belong to which plant, and that's basically what those systems are predicting. If you look how this looks in reality, you basically get a vector field for an input image where if everything kind of looks good, you see those arrows pointing to the kind of centroid or to the center of that plant. And so what the important thing to note here is what we get for every pixel in our output, we get one of those offset vectors, so delta x, delta y, or vx, vy vector over here. How do you use this information then? What typically happens, you perform this and you basically get your embeddings in your 2D space, and then you perform a whatever simple clustering algorithm to cluster those objects, and then you basically get the result you see here on the right-hand side, where you see the different colors of the different clusters being identified. And these are basically the ends of those vectors, so where they are shifted to. So it's not one perfect spot, these are kind of, but still nearby clusters. And every of those kind of separated islands of dots gives you then one cluster. And you can theoretically undo this shift, and this then propagates the pixel information back into the image, and this then allows you to make the instance information. And that's how typical systems work. The problem that you're having now is that you, in areas where you have annotated instances, it works actually quite well, but it doesn't really generalize well to instances where you don't have those annotations, because there those vectors are kind of fairly random. And if you see this example here, if you run that, you see some areas of a training data image where you have annotated instances, which looks good, but where you have plants, but which are actually not annotated, those vectors typically don't look really well. And so one of the things is, can we actually add background knowledge what a good plan should look like? And we can actually do that. So if you see such a vector field as a human, you say, you have a pretty good intuition what looks good and what looks bad. So if you have those vector fields like the one shown here, where you have several arrows pointing to a kind of centroid or to the same location, you say, oh, that probably looks good. This is, you can envision how a plan would look like, or an instance would look like in this setup. On the other hand, you can also have a pretty good idea what a bad vector field would be. So one of those explosions you see here is something that typically is not something you expect to see, or kind of these circles of vectors circulating around the spot is something that you wouldn't expect an instance shift vector would look like for a plant. So the question is, can we add this intuition into the network without actually using explicit labels? And the good thing is, yes, you can. And so those people who looked into physics at some point in time, they may have seen vector fields, or also other disciplines, and they are actually measures or traits of those vector fields that you can describe. And two very popular ones are the divergence and the curl of a vector field. So the divergence is actually something, if the divergence is larger than 0, you have kind of these arrows pointing away from a spot. If the divergence which are smaller than 0 actually point to a spot, divergence of 0 is basically a vector field where you have the vectors more or less parallel, moving in one direction. And also the curl, like basically a curl, positive or negative curl, is basically a counterclockwise or clockwise rotation that you're seeing. A curl of 0 would be no rotation. And the good thing is those divergence and curl can be very easily computed from the partial derivatives of the entities that you're having in your vector field. And so you can actually use divergence and curl to express a prior on what the perfect vector field would look like. So if you would imagine the perfect vector field for those foreground pixels for which you do not have any labels, you would expect you have a divergence of -2, so a negative number, because I need to point into one spot. Given that we compute this on a 2D image, on a discretized space, you would actually -2 the dimension of your space. So we have a 2-dimensional space, you would get a -2 for the perfect vector field and a curl of 0. And so what we can now do is we can say, okay, for those foreground pixels, although we don't have labels, we're actually expecting a curl of 0 and a divergence of -2. And so we can add this as additional targets to the optimization function of our neural network, so to our loss function, in order to take this information into account when optimizing our networks. So without actually needing to provide those labels. And this leads to the effect that we can actually get very strong generalization, or much stronger generalization capabilities of those networks. So we have an input image here on the left from a field that we trained in Bonn, and the predicted instances of the plan. So even in situations where they overlap, you get actually quite decent results. And you can transfer this to completely different environments, like in other sites, like in Göttingen, one of our other partner sites. We had different growth stages, different points in time, even slightly different varieties. You still get those predicted instances really well. And so these are one of the works that we are doing in order to kind of boost those networks so that they are better in dealing with small amounts of training data. Once we have that information, we can do monitoring tasks. The question is, what are we going to do with this now? How can we do the right thing in order to kind of boost sustainability or sustainable crop production? Because so far we actually haven't seen any sustainability gains so far, except of maybe for the breeding side. I want to look into weeding here as one of the kind of most obvious examples here. So how are weeds eliminated on the field today? So there are basically two ways. Either you have traditional farming. You basically drive over with your tractor over your field, and you spray a herbicide, so a chemical which affects actually all plants in the field, but has a more detrimental effect to the weeds and kind of doesn't damage your value crop that much. And with this, you're kind of killing all the weed plants and kind of let the value crops survive, at least in the ideal world. However, again, this has a lot of negative impacts on agroecosystems, so we'd actually like to reduce pesticide use. If you do organic farming, you basically have to do that manually. So different ways. On the top image, you see farming in carrots, where you basically have this sort of flyer in Germany where you put people on behind a tractor and you drive slowly over the field, and they're basically eliminating all the weed plants. Or you have other forms of manual weed control, which is obviously that this doesn't scale to organic farming in a large scale. So we can do this on selected fields. That's also one of the reasons why we pay larger amounts for organically grown food. But even if we would like to, we couldn't scale up and say, okay, we change everything to organic farming. It simply wouldn't work because we wouldn't have the workforce to do that. So robots can be seen as new means for weed control, for using them and to analyze what's going on in the field, understanding what's a value crop and what's a weed with the technique I presented before, and then use alternative means for killing those weeds. So if we have our plant segmentation system like camera image, neural network to annotated image, we now want to take an action to eliminate those weeds, so basically kill them. And we have been playing around with this in different projects for quite a while. And one of the examples how we started in 2006, this was a mechanical weeder. This was a project done together with Bosch, which is basically a glorified Bosch nail gun, which was used when you drive over wheat to actually nail weeds back into the ground. So you see that basically here, it's basically a nail gun which can retract the pushing element again. And you can actually drive over a field and find those weed plants and actually kill those weed plants with mechanical stamping. This is one of the ways how you can do mechanical weeding instead of chemical weeding. However, those systems didn't really work that well. They're not substantially very robust, and you cannot drive very fast without actually breaking them if you think about serious production. So this project has been abandoned actually a year later already. And then in the lab, we tried to experiment with lasers. So in this example of the first laser weeding experiments we have done in 2018, using this example, I think a 6 or 4 watt powered laser in order to actually direct it on the wheat plant and actually burn the plant. So the first burn experiment that we have done here, and you can see here in the middle of the image of the plant, you see it's actually burned the stem. And so this wheat plant is very likely to die pretty soon. And so this is kind of not too complicated from a scientific point of view how to do that, but it's actually not too trivial to do that from an engineering point of view. You're driving over the field, you work with high power lasers, you need to direct them to precisely to spots while you're driving. So a bit of engineering goes into that. We have spun off a company called Escada Technologies here from the lab, which actually has worked on laser-based weeding since 2019, and in 2023, so 1.5 years ago, actually, or 2 years ago, we shipped the first laser-based weeding system that we have developed. You see here a tractor, and you see those metal boxes there in the back. And this was basically the weeding unit sits in there, a camera system, high-power laser, in this case, a 500-watt laser, which then kind of kills the weed plant that you're seeing out there. And this is now since 2023 in operation in the United States for organic tomato production for making your ketchup. So it's one of the Morningstar fields, one of the largest tomato producers for ketchup in the US. And if you look inside a box, you see what's happening here. So you see those small flashes popping up. This is actually one of those high power lasers hitting and burning away those wheat plants. If the wheat is not too large, we have kind of times of 15 to 20 milliseconds reaction time, to kill those weeds. And you can see the larger tomato plants are not affected. You can basically now drive over the field and point those lasers and kind of eliminate those weed plants. This was the first prototype that actually you could actually use on larger scales. By now, last year, we got the CE certification, but we're actually now able to also sell those systems. And this is one example how we can use the perception technologies and the action technologies, to reduce herbicide use on our fields and support sustainable crop production. So this was just kind of one example how we can realize chemical-free weeding, one of the things where we are negatively impacting our agro-ecosystems. But there are other ways how we can do this, like better irrigation and fertilization. So there we need to understand which are the nutrients that a plant is missing, or water which is missing, or even crop protection, where we look at plant diseases. And these are tasks which are much harder to do from a perception point of view, because often you see symptoms in an infected crop only when it's too late. So you want to see this early on time. So different spectral bands help here, or performance of the crop in related to environmental information that you need, like models of which is expected crop growth and things like this. So weeding was only the easy part. It's getting more and more and more complicated. And these are tasks that we are working on. So to kind of sum that up a bit, and coming to the end of my 30 minutes here, we need robots in the fields in order to understand what's going on. And this information can then be used in order to do the appropriate actions and do the right interventions in a more sustainable manner or less harmful manner for the environment to do that. And the second thing where monitoring helps us is for breeding companies. So for breeding new crop varieties, the breeding companies need to assess which plant variety performs better or worse under stressing situations or plant stress situations. And here, an objective monitoring of fields at a large scale is actually really helpful for allowing them to make those decisions fast and speed up the breeding process. I and my team, we work a lot on the semantic perception parts for this in-field operations. And again, generalization abilities is something which is a challenge that we are working on, but there are a large number of other tasks and challenges which are still out there. I just showed you a small fraction of what happens here. So overall, I want to close with the statement that I think that autonomous intelligent machines, and couldn't be robots, but could also be machines attached to a tractor, can support crop production and the task around crop production, like breeding, management, and other activities, and offer the potential to change the way we produce crops on our field, and this make a substantial benefit to societal challenges that we are facing right now. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a lot of time for questions. Any questions in the room? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Super, super interesting to see the developments. I guess I have a kind of domain side and a technical side question. Do you ever have to distinguish between crop types on a larger scale? And I was wondering if your group has any experience with using hyperspectral imagery. And also just curious to see what the discourse with the farmers is like about adopting these new technologies, and kind of really what they're looking for and what makes these sorts of products kind of appealing to them.
Okay, so there's several questions. So I start, and you correct me if I miss one. So the first thing is, are there situations where we have to deal with multiple value crops on the same field, for example? not that much in traditional agriculture, where you have typically large fields where you know whatever I'm growing sugar beets on the field, and everything which is not a sugar beet is something I would like to get rid of. But there are, however, new ways we are looking into kind of setting up new field arrangements and building new cropping systems where you start growing different crops on the same field. So if you combine different types of crop, they actually have mutual benefits in terms of getting rid of pests or making pest infections less likely. So there are a lot of experiments currently ongoing from the in crop production where you try to combine different crops on the same field. This has several challenges. I mean, seeding them is now possible. You can basically generate images on the field by how you place your crops, but the management is still fairly challenging because you want to treat, for example, only one type of crop with a certain treatment. And for that, you would need to have that information. So I would say in traditional agriculture, less often. In new ways how you can do field experiments and grow crops, this plays a role. The second question was related using hyperspectral imaging. Yes, hyperspectral information helps. It's especially helpful if you look into nutrient deficiencies, and especially even more relevant if you look into plant diseases. Because especially plant diseases, you often see with your bare eyes or with our RGB channel when it's actually too late, or when the infection is already at a later stage, and then you typically a spread of the infection is very likely. So you would like to treat them earlier. And hyperspectral information or multispectral sensors provide you with valuable information here. So we have worked with cameras using different spectral bands. So they are cameras with 16 to 25 spectral bands that you can still fly well with the drone. They help you for dealing with plant diseases. If you really go to really hyperspectral imaging, we typically have those line cameras where you have kind of 200 spectral bands. That gets more complicated. That works really well in lab environments where you have full control of your lighting conditions. If you're outside with sunlight and kind of clouds coming in front of the sky, you basically need to recalibrate your sensor quite a bit. So that's much more of a challenge. It's also harder to handle based on a drone where you have kind of these line sensors, but then providing you 200 different spectral bands. So yes, hyperspectral information helps you, especially for plant diseases. In the lab, it works well. Outside in the field, it's more difficult to do that, but clearly information helps, but it also dramatically increases the complexity and the cost of those systems. So if you think about research environments, yes, sure, go with it. If you want to bring that out to farmers in production, that's probably something which is much more challenging. So we started out originally with 4-channel cameras, so RGB and near-infrared. And we even dropped the near-infrared channel because it made the cameras so expensive, because producing RGB cameras is so much cheaper than having customized spectral bands in there. This was the second question. The third question was regarding the uptake. So what is needed in order to generate uptake for those technologies? That's a challenging question. So there are different factors which play a role and make uptake difficult. The first thing is you typically have, so the time a machine is used in agricultural at a farm is really fairly large. So a tractor is supposed to last something like 30 years, and typically most of the machinery only amortizes, let's say, after 10 or 15 years. So you need to guarantee fairly long operational times, and also it means that you don't buy a new machine every 2 years, every 3 years, like we buy a new computer or a new telephone. So the cycle times are much lower. There are other ways, like depending on the country you're in. So in Germany, we have something called Maschinenring, which is an association where farmers team up like a cooperative and buy more expensive machinery. And then it's owned by the cooperative, and you basically use this as a service at the different farms. If you don't need things on a daily basis, like a tractor, if you use a harvester, for example, you do harvesting only in certain amounts of the year, and so you can buy that. And so this is one way to do that, also because you need to bring the technical expertise to the farmer. And so it's much easier to embed that in one of those kind of Maschinenring or cooperatives, which actually organize this. But there are also a lot of other incentives, and agriculture is a strongly regulated domain. So policy design is important, and EU regulations or other regulations on what you're allowed to do on your fields determines what happens in agriculture. So one example, for example, glyphosate is not forbidden or hasn't been forbidden 1 or 2 years ago, is basically because there was no alternative as a herbicide, although it's detrimental for the environment, has negative health effects. And if there would be a good alternative, you would simply glyphosate would be forbidden by now. So by bringing up new techniques, regulations can also be a game changer by saying, okay, certain practices that we don't want actually not allowed anymore because we now have an alternative. This is also something where it's very likely that you will change the game based on that. But general, I would say without incentives for farmers and ways for using all subsidies, like whatever, what the EU is basically doing at the moment, subsidizing certain elements, and I think 20 or 30% of the subsidies that farmers are getting is now actually tied to some biodiversity benefits, like flowering strips and things like this. And you can actually take that to the next level with these technologies. So it'll have also a substantial impact from my perspective. Did I cover all your questions or did I forget something?
It did, thank you. Sorry to monopolize, but thanks for your generosity on answering those so comprehensively.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, you kind of mentioned at the beginning the detrimental effects of large-scale agriculture.
Yep.
On insect populations, and I assume like by reducing the amount of like herbicides used, that would have some kind of improvement on outcomes for insects.
Yep.
Are there any kind of specific applications of this kind of robotic and sensing technology that is like for reducing pesticide input or making farmland more kind of usable by insect populations in general?
Yeah, so there are different ways what you can do. So first, of course, I mean, you can take this laser as chemical-free weeding that I presented, but the first and more likely application that is brought into practice is what's called spot spraying. So basically, instead of spraying uniformly with a nozzle which just powers out herbicides or pesticides, you basically have a lot of small nozzles which you can control through a computer. So with the computer vision system, you just can activate and deactivate a nozzle depending if you're on top of a weed or not. And with this technology, you can already dramatically reduce the amount of herbicides that you spray in a field. So the numbers are something between 50% to 90% savings on herbicides. You can dramatically reduce the amount of herbicide that you need in a field with a technology which is not too different from what's out there already, which is always a big advantage because farmers are used to herbicides, they are used to spraying systems, and if it's just kind of an electronically controlled nozzle, it's much more likely to make it into production than coming up with high power lasers, which also have also some challenges in terms of safety operations, I have to admit. So this is definitely one thing where we're seeing this coming into practice, and these are probably the first things where it comes into practice. Also other things where you do a mechanical weeding, at least the problem with mechanical weeding is you typically cannot come close enough to the value crop, but in areas where you're a little bit further away, like in the middle of the rows, you can also do some mechanical weeding, which is typically easier to be done and need less computer brain power to do that well. So this is one thing. Yes, you had a second question, sorry.
But just broadly, and then, you know, how you kind of assess outcomes for insect populations and whether or not these kind of like weeding or, you know, herbicide protocols do kind of have positive outcomes. Yeah, so by simply reducing it by 90%, that's already a big benefit, although we currently cannot really quantify exactly how much better it is. So have we solved 90% of the problem, or have we only solved 20% of the problem because still the small amount of herbicide is still detrimental? So this is not a fully answered question. But there are also other things you can do by, for example, I was talking about these new cropping systems or these new field arrangements which are out there, where you adapt fields to the landscape and also grow different crops on the same field. So there are different crops you can combine to actually support biodiversity and insects. So if you have whatever Phacelia is one of those plants which is really liked by the bees, it's what's called the bee friend, and if you kind of combine them in your current field arrangements, you can actually dramatically increase the number of bees that you and other pollinators which are out there. So you can actually start with different field designs which need to be planned, and the question is how large should they be, how should they look like, in order to promote insect biodiversity on our field. And this is one of the steps we are now taking in kind of the next phase of our cluster, where we do actually biodiversity monitoring as well. So we're trying to assess how many insects are out there, and then you can actually do more sophisticated field experiments in trying to estimate what are field arrangements, how should they look like, which plants should you combine at which spatial scale in order to support biodiversity. But again, this is another activity, another track you can go, because robots allow you to do that management
at a scale or at a granularity, which are typically right now can only be done by humans, but which simply don't scale if you do it as a human. So you need to automate that. And I think this is a big difference, makes a big difference in the end.
Super cool, thank you.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for the talk. My question about like the segmentation on the 2D images. You have the 2D offset vector as an intuition method to enhance segmentation. I think it's very interesting. Do you think this is generalizable, like to like the 3D point clouds and other applications? Like if I want to segment out like the individual trees, do you think it's easy to define such a vector as a regularization for the tree shapes?
Okay, so I have two answers to this. First, does it generalize to other objects and plants? Yes, it does, as long as you can separate the foreground and background. So because you want to separate those foreground objects that you're interested in from the background, because in the background, those offset vectors don't make any sense. So, and you want to enforce those constraints only in the foreground object. So if you have something where you can separate background from the rest, then it should actually work. Then there's no reason why it is plant specific, and you can also apply that to other tasks. This is kind of the first aspect of this. The second thing is kind of 2D and 3D. And here we thought it will perfectly work in 3D. You just need to change whatever. You basically change the divergence to -3. You can easily show that it should be -3 and this will work. We failed dramatically with that. And one of the reasons for that is that your image that you're having, it's typically a fully dense structure. So you have pixel information, you have color information in every of your pixels. If you use sensor to build point clouds, you typically have a lot of occlusions, you have stuff we don't see, you have gaps in there, and those things actually disturb the vector field. So the quality of the vector field in 3D was much worse than it was in a 2D image. So we tried using this in 3D, at least for plants, with kind of the 3 point clouds built with RGBD cameras from the plants, and the results were not convincing. So the gain that we were getting with this approach was tiny to not existing. So therefore I say, I thought it would perfectly work. If you have really good point clouds, it also gives you an advantage. But if you have a lot of occlusions and low quality data, unfortunately, it doesn't give us the result that we expected to get.
Anybody else? Anybody online have a question? You can unmute yourself. Okay, so I had a question as well. So more of a position perhaps. I noticed that you said in the beginning that there aren't very many data sets of crops. So there is a problem with label data and so on. I was wondering whether it might be helpful to create, based on the data that you have, perhaps a benchmark that you could have almost like a competition for people to come up with the best segmentation task or other task, labeling task. And so, by making the data available to the other people, the whole field advances, because maybe other people have different ideas which would still be helpful.
Absolutely. This is a very good question. I'm happy to say that we share nearly all our data. And we even put whatever labeling years into the labeling things. And one of the things is called PhenoBench. So if you Google for PhenoBench, you actually find a website, put it into the chat as well, where we provide a lot of data that we recorded here over different growing seasons, manually labeled, and you can actually run this, and then it can actually upload your results to a benchmark server, and the benchmark server will automatically rate your results and compare it to all the other people who submitted. So similar to whatever Kitty was for autonomous driving activities, something like this we have done as well. We have that for image-based annotations, like all the work that you've seen here actually stems from PhenoBench, as PhenoBench data, which can also be freely used. We also provide, in addition to that, a lot of unlabeled images in order to allow approaches to look more into unsupervised techniques, which I think is something I'm personally interested in. We say you have a small amount of supervision labels, but a much larger amount of unsupervised data, because just attaching a camera to a drone or a tractor is easy if you just are interested in the images. So we even, in addition to PhenoBench, provide large amounts of unlabeled data that you may use if you're working with unsupervised or semi-supervised data. And we recently also released 3D data. So if you're interested in point clouds, not just in images, we have fields here where we run a full bundle adjustment and structure from motion pipeline, doing full 3D reconstruction of the plans from different viewpoints at field scale, provide semantic annotations also in 3D. This is recently released at last IROS in 24. So on my website, there are all the data sets and links to data with data sets papers. You should find a lot of things, and all come with automatic evaluations, partially even benchmark systems where you can upload stuff without having access to a hidden test set and things like this. So we put actually quite some efforts into making this easily accessible for others and also allowing for fair comparisons.
That's really very commendable. Thank you very much. I think we're out of questions here, and yeah, so thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Very inspiring. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for having me. Thank you very much for the time, and have a nice remaining day and nice weekend later on.
Thank you.
Perfect. Bye-bye.
Bye.